Welcome everyone to today's webinar on indirect cost rates, what you need to know. My name is Candy Carmi and I'm the Technical Assistance Specialist with the Eastern Region Training and Technical Assistance Center. I've been providing technical assistance for the Eastern Region for the past 8 years, and I'm a member of the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin. We have a lot to go over today. But I did want to provide you a little bit of information about the Administration for Native Americans, which is a program located within the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services under the Administration for Children and Families. ANA serves all Native Americans, including federally recognized tribes, American Indian and Alaska Native organizations, Native Hawaiian organizations, and Native populations throughout the Pacific Basin. ANA promotes self-sufficiency for Native Americans by providing discretionary grant funding for community-based projects, as well as training and technical assistance to eligible tribes and Native organizations in 3 program areas: social and economic development strategies, which is also known as SEDS, Native languages, and environmental regulatory enhancement. You can find out a lot more about the Administration for Native Americans by going to their website, and the URL is on your screen, www.acf.hhs.gov/ANA. So please visit their website if you haven't already done so. As I said previously, this webinar is being hosted by the Eastern Region Training and Technical Assistance Center, which is a resource of the Administration for Native Americans. We're a contractor headquartered outside of Washington, D.C. in Reston, Virginia. We are one of 4 technical assistance providers that provide help to both ANA applicants and grantees. Our presenter today is my counterpart from the Pacific region. If you visit our website, and again the URL is on your screen, you'll find out more information about us on upcoming trainings, and you can also like us on our Facebook page. You'll also find links to the other 3 regions. We are very fortunate today to have Susan White as our presenter. Susan has over 30 years experience in the field of financial management, and she has a proven track record of providing contract oversight and administration, as well as providing monitoring, on-site training, and technical assistance to organizations and programs in the areas of comprehensive planning, resource development, organizational development, financial management, staff development, administrative operating policies and procedures, and economic development. So I'm now going to turn it over to Susan White. Susan?
Okay, thank you very much, Candy. And we're going to be talking about indirect today, you guys. So it's going to be fun. Okay, here's what we're going to cover. We're going to cover indirect cost. What is it? You know, you keep hearing that term. What are we talking about here? We're going to talk about the different types of rates, all right? Although we're not going to be talking about multiple bases, we are going to be talking about, you know, different ways of structuring your indirect. I want to talk about some key terms that are very, very important as you move through the indirect process. And next, the different types of rates and the different bases and that, how they work, how it looks, what role they play. One thing that I think is really important that we discuss is how you manage your indirect costs. Okay, that's just pretty key to indirect, is the management of the indirect. And then we're going to look at how do we determine if indirect cost is right for us. So we'll look at some of the factors that will impact that. And finally, okay, all tribes that I know of have indirect cost rates, but for those organizations that are thinking about it right now, What do I need to do? I've decided it's the right thing for me, so how do I get an indirect cost rate? That's basically what we're going to be covering in 50 minutes. That's impressive, you guys, to hit indirect in 50 minutes, all right? So let's get going on this. Well, first of all, what is indirect? We keep hearing that term indirect. What is indirect? Indirect is really, all it is the cost of doing business. That it's very hard to attach it to like a single program. It's not a participant expense or something like that you can attach it to a single grant activity or contract activity or in one of your cooperative agreements. They're kind of joint costs that are just necessary to keep things running. Some examples of indirect costs would be like accounting. Okay, you have your fiscal people up there and they're running 100 checks and over 20 or 30 different programs. How do you track that by program? That'd be a tough one. Same thing with HR, human resources. You know, how do you allocate your time? That would just be a timekeeper's nightmare if they had to track who they were talking to at every point in the day. Okay, IT. Okay, if you have IT people, how do we track that cost by each one of our different grants or that? And so, what do we do with that? Audit. Audit is another typical indirect cost. Administrative staff, if you have executive directors, administrative support, all of those are examples of it. Your corporate insurance, we can list on and on, the different examples of what potentially could be indirect costs. All right, now I want to make one thing really clear. Indirect, there's no difference between direct and indirect costs as far as allowability of those costs. It's just that indirect is shared amongst all of the different programs of your tribe or your organization or your college. So it's really a basic administrative cost. We hear it called indirect, we hear it called overhead, we hear it called administration. Well, the way that we do it with the federal government is that we get an indirect cost rate. Okay, and what an indirect cost rate is, it's just a way to fairly charge each of the programs their share of those costs, their share for accounting, their share for the liability insurance, their share for IT, whatever it is. It's just a way to charge each of the programs in a very simple way for their share of the administrative costs. That's all it is. Okay? Now let's look. Let me give you an example of some of the different types of rates that are out there that you can use. Okay? Some indirect cost rates are based on all direct costs with a couple of things pulled out. Some indirect cost rates are based on direct labor only. Some indirect cost rates are based on direct labor and fringe benefits. There's all different kinds of configurations that are used to determine what your indirect cost rate is going to be. And hopefully we'll give you enough information to make a good informed decisions over what works best for you throughout this webinar. Let's go over some key terms. Okay, the first one is cognizant agency. Well, who's my cognizant agency? Okay, well, what is a cognizant agency is an even better question. Your cognizant agency is the federal agency that on behalf of all federal agencies you negotiate your indirect cost rate with. They establish your indirect cost rate. So how do you determine who your cognizant agency is going to be? Well, for tribes, that's easy. It's the Department of Interior. That's already a done deal, all right? And so for tribes, they're working with the National Business Center of the Department of Interior. For other organizations, like colleges and for nonprofits, how you would determine who your cognizant agency would be is who provides the majority of your funding, right? Who do you get the most money from? It could be HHS. For some groups, it's Department of Labor. For other groups, it might be HUD, Housing and Urban Development. you have to look at where you're getting the bulk of your money from. So, cognizant agency, that's real important to determine who's going to be your cognizant agency. Right. The next term is, what's my indirect cost pool? Well, your indirect cost pool is what you determine it to be. It's kind of a grouping of those administrative costs. All right? So it's taking a look at what are these things that we're going to call administrative costs. And I think it's really important to understand that what you use for administrative costs will vary by each tribe, by each organization. There is no one set of this is an indirect cost, this is not. There's certain ones that we can speak to logically would be indirect, but there's others. It's all over the board. So they're not the same. It's not the same. No cost pool is the same between different organizations or tribes. And how you determine what's going to go in your cost pool is the first thing you do is you look at your expenditures. Now here's an example of annual expenditures for one organization. Their total expenditures for that year was $4.6 million. What they're going to want to do is take a look at what of these are indirect costs. So let's take a look at that. Now look at labor. Of that $2.1 million spent on labor, $300,000 was probably an accountant. It might have been an HR, part of the time of an executive director, maybe part of the time of some administrative support staff. Okay, because this isn't a real large organization, so they'll say that. And then the fringe benefits. Well, this looks like it's about a 20% fringe benefit rate, so the fringe benefits that apply to those direct labor that's indirect will also be indirect fringe benefits, and they go into the indirect cost pool as well. We can look at other line items. They spent $392,000 on travel, of which $1,602 was for indirect expenses. Contractual, same thing. Of the $635,000, they determined that $66,000 was an indirect expense. We look at insurance, go all the way down towards insurance. That must be corporate liability insurance, and it looks like all of it is going to go into the indirect cost. But again, I really want to emphasize that this is very specific to each tribe, each organization, or each college. And that's one thing, is to really know what your indirect costs are and analyze those costs. But the indirect cost that you put in there is called your pool. So we can clearly see in this example, in their indirect cost pool, they have labor, fringe, travel, contractual, postage, rent, supplies, ADP, educational materials, printing, telephone, all the way down. They don't have maintenance. They don't have conference costs in the indirect. But the costs that you charge, the line items that you charge to indirect, is called your cost pool. That's an important term. The next important term that we have is your base. Okay? Now, there are several different types of bases that you can use. All right? One that's very commonly used is direct salaries. You can use direct salaries and fringe benefits, right? You can use either one of those two. I've seen some cases where they use direct salaries and wages, including vacation, holiday, sick pay, and other paid leaves. The reason I'm pulling that out is because some organizations charge their paid leave to fringe benefits. And if you're in that situation, you would pull it out to ensure that you're showing the total direct salaries paid to staff. So what does that look like in your calculations? It looks like this. Here again we have our same budget, all right, and There's my $582,000 in indirect costs. But what we have here is our base on this is direct labor. So there's my 1.8 million is my direct salaries. Again, my 582,000 are my costs. So that equates to a 26.9% indirect cost rate. All right? Do we all see that? See, the only base I have is the 1.8 million. Now we're looking at it with fringe benefits. I think I'm messing up on how I'm forwarding the slides. Oh, okay. This is it, but it should be 1.8 million. I apologize, you guys. Okay, now if we look at labor and fringe, all right, we add those two together, and my base becomes the 2.1 million. So I take my pool of 582,000 and I divide it by the direct labor and the fringe, and I come up with 26.9%. 26.9% indirect cost rate. Now you see that my indirect cost pool and expenses haven't changed at all. The only thing that's changed here is my base. All right? Now, a real common way, the next one we're going to look at, is when you use modified direct costs. And that's typically all your direct costs with the exception of like equipment, other capital expenditures, and any subawards or contracts that you have in excess of $25,000. And it's the portion in excess of that. So, using this kind of base, let's see how that affects my rate. Now my base is 3.7 million because, as you can see, I'm counting all of my direct expenses. I've excluded my contracts over 25,000, the portion over 25,000, which you have to do. I don't have any equipment in here that I pull out of my base. All right? So that gives me a base of 3.7 million, and I divide that into my same $582,204, and what I come up with is 15.3% indirect cost rate. So what's real important is to understand how your base impacts your rate. And when you're looking at this, you want to make some considerations because you're going to try and keep your indirect rate stable. So what is it stable if you just use personnel? Are all of your costs pretty stable? You know, you really want to factor those things in. The other thing I want to point out with this is a lot of times I'll hear people say, oh, they have an indirect cost rate of 32%. It's so high. Well, we don't know that. We don't know that because we don't know what their base is and we don't know what's in their pool, which are their expenses. They may have a lot of things that programs don't have to pay for directly in their indirect pool, okay, and really they're paying for it through an indirect rate. So again, just by the percentage that someone tells you, you can't, that doesn't really determine, you know, whether or not, you know, it's a real high rate or not. And that's important to look at. There's a couple other types of bases too that are used. Okay, this one's used by a lot of colleges and universities, and it's total direct costs, but they exclude more than capital expenditures and contracts and subawards in excess of $25,000, or the excess, I should say. They also exclude off-site activities, student tuition payments, and student support costs. Okay, so that's another type of rate or type of base that we see. And then still another base, and I can honestly tell you, I've actually never seen this before. They use modified total direct costs, but they only use certain direct costs. Salaries we see a lot, fringe benefits we see a lot, but they also put materials into their base, materials and supplies, services, travel, and subawards up to $25,000. Now this I've only read about. I've actually never really seen this type of base use, but it is one that's talked about in all of the regulations and things like that, all of the literature on indirect. So there's different types of bases that you can use. Again, your pool will be very specific to your organization and what type of base you will use. And you'll make the decision on, to me, what you would make it on would be stability of the base. All right? You want a base that doesn't fluctuate a lot so that you can better manage your indirect rate. So I'm going to talk about the importance of management of your indirect rate. Now there's different types of rates, right? There's what's known as a provisional rate, and frequently if you have a provisional rate you go from provisional to final. So you would have a provisional rate for probably the year that you're in, it's assigned before that year, and then after the year's over and you get your audit done and you're submitting a proposal again, you would go to a final rate. So it's provisional to final. Okay? Another type of rate is called a predetermined rate. And they just say, okay, you're getting 10%. Do with it as you will. I mean, you still have to have all the support documentation and stuff, but this is your rate. This is what it's going to be. It's not subject to change. All right? And then you have what's used by a lot of federal aid, or not a lot, by the a lot by the Department of Interior, is fixed rates with carry forward. And what that means is that you will have this rate this year, okay, but say that you actually spend more. You're going to carry forward the liability for the expenses. You skip a year or so into a different period, and you'll be able to recover then. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But it's called a fixed carry forward rate. And that's typically what I've seen coming out of Interior. In fact, I don't think I've seen anything else but that, but I'm sure there are other rates coming out of there for tribes. All right? So those are the different types of rates. And again, it depends on who you're working with, the agency in that. For nonprofits, you'll probably do provisional with final. You know, I've tried with nonprofits to get fixed carry forward and couldn't do it. With tribes, probably fixed rates with carry forward. There's some agencies that give you a predetermined rate, and then that's not subject to change. So there's different rates to look at. Okay, let's talk about managing the indirect cost rate. Okay. There's a couple things that you need to do for managing the indirect cost rate. All right? And the things that I want to talk about that I find most important, all right, is revenue versus expenditures, staff training, rate changes, consistent treatment of costs, budget limitations, and under and over recovery of rates. So let's take a look at each one of these. Okay, revenue equals expenditures. I'm really strong on this, you guys, is that you try to keep your rate stable from year to year to year. Because when you don't, there's a whole lot of consequences that happen with large fluctuations in rates. So basically, you want your revenue to equal your expenditures. Okay, but here's the problem. You may have an indirect cost budget, right? Start of the year, you know you've got you have budgeted $582,000 for indirect, and you've got all your expenses lined out. You know you have programs that will support that amount. But what happens if the programs don't spend all their funds? Okay, you only are able to generate indirect revenue off expenditures. So you may have a budget of $582,000 and you're using modified indirect costs, so you're planning on spending let's pretend you're planning on spending $4 million in direct costs. Well, if they only spend $3 million in direct costs, you now have only about $425,000 in revenue. And if you spend your full budget, you're going to be in what's called under recovery. okay, you're not going to have enough revenue coming in to cover the expenditures. So it's real important that in my world that you really try to manage that rate so you don't get in that situation where you're in what's called under recovery. If you're in fixed carry forward, yeah, you may get that money eventually. But I say the best way to handle this is just try and keep your rate stable. And if funding decreases or that, you manage your expenditures so that they line up with the revenue that you're generating. And I know that's much easier said than done. But I think indirect needs to be monitored and managed closer than any grant, contract, or cooperative agreement that you have to try and keep that rate stable once you've decided what a good rate for you is and what works for your organization or your tribe. All right? So I just really harp on that. Try and keep the revenue and the expenditures as closely aligned as possible and be watching it weekly to see where you're at, and at the very least monthly, and make appropriate adjustments as you move through the year. Okay. The other thing in managing your rate that I think is important, and Rondell thinks it's really important because I wasn't talking about this and she reminded me yesterday, hey, a lot of staff don't know about indirect, which is true. I think it's important to train all staff on indirect. How many times have you guys heard, I don't know what indirect is for, I just know we pay it to the tribe. I don't think we should have to pay it, it just goes somewhere and I don't know what it's for. I think it's important that staff understand what the indirect is paying for. Okay, what's the purpose of it? And what are the costs that are included in that pool? All right? So the purpose is for administration and shared costs. You know, think how expensive it would be if every program had to hire their own accountant or every program had to hire their own IT person. Right? It's for shared costs. It's to help operate your programs and everything, all activities, more efficiently and effectively. And so I think it's important staff know what the purpose of indirect is. Also, they should know what costs are included in that. You know, is it your audit? Is it your IT? Is it your accounting? What costs do they not need to worry about in their budgets for their different funding streams that you already have covered in indirect? And again, once they understand that, they will see what the money's going for. And then also, it's important for staff to understand if there's going to be potential rate changes that are going to impact some of their programs. So I believe staff training is so critical that all staff need to understand what indirect is. You know, so many times they go, well, we should ask for a waiver of indirect. Well, no, you don't really want to do that. You know, if they're going to supplement it, you know, at least don't have requirements attached. Indirect does have a purpose, and it's paying for things that you would otherwise have to pay for directly, and it would probably be more expensive if you did it that way. So let staff know. Let staff know. Then if there's going to be potential changes, you know, they need to know that too, because it's going to impact their budgets and what the money they've planned on spending for services. Okay. Rate changes, again, here I'm harping, and I know you're telling me I've heard this before, but when you have a rate change, that requires rebudgeting, okay? Now, I'm not talking, you know, let's put BIA and IHS and contract support costs off to the side here, okay? Because we're doing this for A&A. When A&A gives you a budget, if you go in there with a rate of 10%, okay, that's what you're going to get as your line item. Okay. Now, if that rate changes and you need to apply, you know, more, you're going to have to rebudget among those other direct cost line items, such as your personnel, your travel, all of your different line items that you have. So if the rate goes up, that means that program directors will have less money to spend on the project. Okay? If the rate goes down, they'll have more money when you're locked into a certain amount by the grant award. Okay? because you are allowed to rebudget within the categories. But look at this, look at the example that we have here. Say that 3 months into the grant, the rate goes from 10% to 15%. Well, when the grant was approved, it was approved at a 10% rate, so they put $30,000 into the indirect line item. 3 months later, the rate changes to 15%. That means that program director and the finance people are going to have to work to find that additional $11,250 for the 9-month period to cover the additional indirect cost. So when there are rate changes, you do need to look at each one of the programs. If there has to be some rebudgeting done because of restrictions of the funding source, you need to do those right away. You need to do those so that you don't get hit in the end with, oh my goodness, you know, we got to stop spending right now because we don't have our indirect costs covered. So in managing it, again, you need to manage changes in the rate as well, because that does happen. Rates change. I mean, I would be talking pipe dreams if I told you rates never changed. And my own change, you know, as closely as I watch it. So it's real important in management that you also manage rate changes. Okay, the other thing that's real important in management of your indirect is that there's always consistent treatment of costs. There always has to be consistent treatment of costs. Okay, it doesn't mean that one program pays for space and the other program doesn't have to pay for space. All right? If space is included in the indirect cost pool, then nobody pays for it. It comes out of indirect. You can't just say, well, this program doesn't have much money, so, you know, we won't charge them. This program has a lot of money, so we'll charge them extra for their space and extra for IT and that. There has to be consistent treatment of cost. Okay, all across the board in what costs go into indirect and what ones are direct charged. All right? The other thing that's real important is that indirect cost has to be allocated to all of your funding sources that are in the base. It absolutely has to, both federal and non-federal. So once you establish that rate, you have to live with it. Okay? And again, for my tribes, I'm not talking about here directly funded indirect. So that's not the issue here. I'm talking about when it's a straight single allocation. Okay? So you have to apply it to everybody. And what happens if you don't apply it, then that indirect, that portion of indirect has to be made up by, you know, unrestricted funds. So again, it's real important that you make sure that once you decide what your pool is, okay, that you consistently charge that. And once you decide what your base is, you're going to have to charge everyone that's in your base indirect. It's not an arbitrary decision. Okay. Another thing that we run into with indirect costs is that there's a lot of funding sources that limit the amount that can be charged for indirect. All right? So if your indirect cost rate is 15%, but there's a 10% cap by that funding source on administrative costs, okay, you're going to have to make up that 5% difference with unrestricted funds if that's included in your base. And that's real important to understand. It has the same kind of effect as the underfunding of contract support costs, okay? You have to make up that difference. So it really does affect. You need to know who your funders are and how much they allow for indirect when you're looking at what we should include in our pool, our indirect costs, and what our base should be. If the funding source allows 8%, you've got a negotiated rate of 10%, okay, you're going to have to make up the 2% with unrestricted because we have to have consistent treatment, and you have to charge indirect to all those funding sources that are in your base. So that's a factor in your indirect when you're looking at your base and your pool. That's all a factor. And then the last thing I want to talk about is over recovery and under recovery. Okay? Now, if you have a provisional rate that goes to final and you over recover, say that your rate is 15%, but when your audit's done, you only spent 14% of your direct costs, you're going to have to pay that 1% back to your funding sources. All right? But say that you were at 15% as a provisional, and when you finalize, you go to 16%. Well, good luck getting that 1% from your funders. I mean, you know, that's like, and I know when we go to the financial management regs, they say if you need more money, you can ask for it. And you do have, you can ask for it, but I think we all know where you'll end up on that end of the stick. All right? So that again, that's what will happen. Over recovery, you will have to pay it back. Under recovery, you know, you can ask the funding sources for it. Now, if you go to final, like in our other example, you know, during when the grant is still active and hasn't closed out, then you can rebudget and you can recover that money. But if the grant has closed out, you know, again, good luck. Now, let's take a look at it from another standpoint, over recovery. If you have fixed rates with carry forward, you're actually in a much better position because the rate will be adjusted in the appropriate period to under recover to make up for any over recovery. And I hope I'm not driving you guys nuts here with over-unders. And if you under-recover in the appropriate period, they will adjust the rate so that you can over-recover and get that money back. The only problem with that is cash flow. You're out the money for about 2 years, all right? And then you can recover it back. So you do get that money eventually if you have fixed rate with carry forward, all right? If you go provisional final and the grant has closed out by the time you get your final, it might be very, very difficult to get those costs covered, right? So again, that's why I say keep that rate stable as you can possibly keep it with all the factors that impact it being variable all the time. But again, I think for management of the rate, there's certain things that you really, really need to keep an eye on. You need to watch it. You need to watch it closer than anything else, and that's your revenue equals expenditures, that your staff have a good understanding of indirect, what it's used for and what's covered by it, that you try and keep your rate stable, but if there is a change and the grants are still active, you go in immediately and rebudget as allowable and appropriate. Okay, always consistently treat each cost the same. Okay, be very cognizant of any budget limitations, because even when you're deciding whether to go after a funding source, you need to see if there's a limitation that would impact overall operations before you apply for it. And under and over recovery, how do you handle it? How do we deal with it? Because it will happen. So those are the things with management that I think are so key. I think those are the key things. Now, what we're going to move on to next is really taking a look at whether or not indirect cost is right for you. If you don't have an indirect cost rate yet, so if you're considering negotiating an indirect cost rate, because again, remember I told you when we started, everything that you charge as indirect, any type of cost, could also be charged as a direct cost. And there's some real serious considerations before you jump in it with both feet. All right? First of all, you need to look at the organizational structure. Is it easy to identify shared administrative costs? Typically it is. Typically it is unless it's a very, very small organization. Okay? You also want to look at your level of federal funding. You really, should have multiple grants, contracts, and cooperative agreements, that share in the expense. you have one major grant, you might as well direct charge it because really, I mean, everything's getting charged to that. Okay, but once you start getting up where you have a lot of grants, you know, you have 50, 100, 300, indirect works really, really well. Okay, you need to take a look at your accounting system, you know, and the functionality of it. Hopefully it has the capacity to track these costs separately. You need that kind of functionality just to comply with the financial management standards of tracking everything by revenue source and expenditures. So you should have that if you have multiple streams of funding, you know, and it should be within the accounting system and not, you know, 10,000 Excel spreadsheets somewhere. Okay, financial management. Okay, do you have procedures in place to support the tracking of shared administrative costs? And that's also pretty simple too. If you have multiple grants, you probably have timesheets where you track people's time by funding source and things like that. So you should have that. When you're at a point where you can really benefit from an indirect cost rate, you should already have those types of systems in place. You know, you need those kinds of systems just to comply with the financial management rates. Okay, one thing that I think is really critical is you look at the award limitations. Look at your different funding streams. Which ones of those have a cap on administration? You know, and what is that cap and how close is it to where you think your administrative costs need to be? I think that needs to be a real serious consideration. Because sure, it sounds good to get money, but if you're having to supplement the administrative expense of those projects, you really need to see what kind of drain that is on the tribe and on, you know, the organization. So I think that's a real serious thing to take a look at. All right? And then the last thing is, what's the staff capacity right now? Do they understand indirect? You know, for whoever's going to be negotiating it, do they know how to negotiate it? Do you know how to develop a proposal? And especially the management of it. I mean, for me, the easy thing is getting the rate. The tough thing is managing it and management of it. So I think it's a real serious consideration. I know when I was starting out, we would hear from all our funding sources, oh, you need to negotiate an indirect cost rate. Oh, you need to negotiate it. So we just went ahead and did it, right? You know, without putting much thought to it. Well, and I'm really serious about this. Indirect costs can either be your best friend or your worst nightmare, all right? So you need to put a lot of thought into it. In fact, you guys, that's what I wanted to call this workshop, but Rondell wouldn't let me. But you need to put a lot of thought into it before you jump in. And I think indirect is wonderful and have used it for years. You know, but you have to know what the risks are, you need to know what your responsibilities, and you need to manage it. And again, it takes more management than the worst program, than the program that requires the most data, because you never know what you're going to be getting in revenues. It's almost like a private business. You don't know what you're going to have in sales. You know, so you have to look at how much you sell if you can afford to buy this. But really put a lot of thought into it. And I'm a strong advocate for indirect costs, but, you know, you just need to make sure that you have it. You've put a lot of thought into it. The staff are well trained. You have management systems in place to manage it. And even if you do already have an indirect cost rate, again, evaluate what's in your pool, what your base is. You know, do we have well-trained staff? Do all our program people understand it? And what systems do we have in place for management of it? Okay. So now that you've heard kind of some of the problems in that, I still think indirect's good. You decide you really want to move forward with getting an indirect cost rate if you don't already have one. Okay, well, the first step is to identify each one of your activities, you know, in each one of your programs or your departments, okay, and what the costs of those are. And then you take it and you break it out. These are direct costs, these are indirect costs. And that's, you know, that's pretty easy. You may say, oh, I've got 5% of the executive director's time. Well, instead of, you know, I'll move that, you know, move that to indirect like we did on that one slide. or I'm paying 10% of a bookkeeper's time, move that over to indirect. You know, just split it out. You know, these will be direct. Here's my total expenses, $4 million. Of that, 3.5 million is direct, and 0.5 million is indirect. It's as simple as that. Okay? The next thing you have to do is you have to pull out capital expenditures. You have to pull out a couple other things. The excess of over $25,000 for grants or subawards. And then also you need to pull out any fundraising dollars that you spend. All right? Okay. And that will give you your base. Okay. And again, there's ways to get multiple rates, but we don't have time to talk multiple rates in the next 2 minutes. Okay. So we're just talking simplified allocation method here. And then the next thing is compute the rate. Compute the rate. What's it going to be? You know, I would compute it by salaries only, salaries and fringe, modified direct costs, see which way works for me. All right. Okay. But again, I say always we'll look at this. If you have some major funding sources and what your rate is exceeds what they'll allow for administration, you need to go back in and look at what you've got in your pool, okay, and what your base is. So again, take a look at that. Okay. If you're not a tribe, determine who's going to be your cognizant agency, all right, and that's who you get the majority of funding from. And then I say, I recommend you contact that agency and request guidance, because each agency likes to see the indirect cost proposals, which you have to submit every year. You know, they like to see it a certain way. And all of them have really good guidance, and they're very, very helpful. My experience, I've worked with a lot of different federal agencies on negotiating rates, so they've been so helpful. And you know, sometimes not as timely as we'd like, but that's because they're so backlogged, but very helpful. And they'll show you how they want the information presented and, you know, what you need to include in that proposal. And you just need to follow that guidance, right? And then you prepare your indirect cost proposal and you submit it to the cognizant agency. Now, again, you will be submitting proposals every year. You're supposed to submit it 6 months after your corporate year ends. Your proposal will be based on your corporate year. Okay, that's kind of tough to do because they like the audit to accompany it, and if your audit's not done in 6 months, then, you know, kind of waiting on that. But every year you submit it. Every year you submit it. So once you're in, okay? It's kind of like getting married. You submit it every year until you get divorced and decide you don't want indirect anymore. Okay? But again, indirect, I think, is a wonderful tool for distributing administrative costs. It just needs to be managed appropriately. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to Candy, because we're done, guys.
Well, thank you so much, Susan. That was a lot of great information, and I can see that we have already quite a few questions generated, so get ready for to answer some questions. Because there was so much information today, you might want to view this webinar again, and if so, the recording is going to be available in about 2 weeks, and the information on how to access it is up on your screen. And I also want just to let you know that ANA does host weekly webinars on various topics. Webinars are held every Thursday from 3 p.m. to 4 p.m. Eastern Time. I want to make a note that next week there will not be a webinar, since next Thursday is right before the 4th of July holiday. And also, I omitted, there is a webinar on July 10th on trauma-informed programming, focusing on how trauma, especially trafficking, impacts successful implementation of programming. And then Eastern Region will be hosting a webinar on July 17th on the Census Bureau and how to navigate their resources to find information on your tribe or community and native data. And you can see the entire schedule of webinars as well as register for webinars on ANA's website, and the URL is on the bottom of the screen. So we are now going to go to questions, and I see that there are quite a few of you who already have actually typed in questions. And if you wanted to ask the question directly, you can raise your hand, and I can unmute you, and you can go ahead directly ask the question to Susan. So let's start seeing some of these questions here. Is it possible to get a federally approved ICR before getting a federal grant so that you can build in your IRC in your grant application?
You know what? I don't know. I've never run into that situation, so if you want, I can certainly check on it. Where do you anticipate getting some funding from? And let me check in. I can follow up on that with you.
And I can forward you the individual who asked. I can forward you their email information.
Yeah, I'll have to look that up because, you know, I haven't seen that. That doesn't mean it's not possible. It's just not something I've ever dealt with in the past, okay?
Okay, we have a question from Gina Lewis, and she asks, so does the tribe choose their base calculation and then let the cognizant agency know? And then does the cognizant agency put that rate in a formal letter back to the tribe?
Yes, absolutely. If you go on the Interior's website for tribes Indirect, they'll show different templates that the tribes can use for preparing their indirect cost proposals. The two that I remember was modified direct costs and staff only. And so the tribe will do that, and then they negotiate. There is a negotiation period, and then once you come to an agreement, then you get what's called a negotiation rate agreement that's signed by both parties.
Okay, great, thanks. And Gina had a follow-up question. Does the cognizant agency, Department of Interior, offer guidance on what type of base calculation to use?
Oh yeah, they have a lot of really good information. They absolutely do. If you go to their website, they really have some good information on it. And they don't tell you what the base is, but they speak a lot, because especially when we're talking about tribes and that, we're talking about some direct funded, indirect, and it gets fairly complex. But the guidance is extremely good. There's a lot of information available on their website, and but I think the tribes then, you know, really have to make some strong, hard decisions on moving forward. But I think Interior is very good at providing support to assist you with that process.
Great, thanks, Susan. Here's another question. It's from Allison Collins. How is the $11,250 amount calculated?
Oh, I knew somebody was going to want to see that number. Okay, so I went from 10% to 15%, right? So that means I need another $15,000 on an annual basis. But remember, I said this is for only 9 months. So 75% of $15,000 is the $11,250. Okay.
Great. Are program directors and managers of single project programs an indirect cost or a direct cost? And that's from Tom Zizzo.
You're a program director, and all you have is your program to handle, right? If I'm understanding that correctly, then you would be a direct cost. Now, if you're doing, you know, and if the organization only has one funding stream, that one funding stream, I direct cost everything. So, but if you have other responsibilities, say that you have to spend maybe 2 hours a week, and you have your organization has lots of different programs, and you have to spend 2 hours a week on accounting, not for your program, but accounting across the board, it's a shared cost, then you would charge those 2 hours to indirect. And if you have further questions, I think Candy's going to give you how to get a hold of me, and we can talk about your specific situation, okay? Because everything's so specific to each organization and each tribe.
Yes, and we do have your contact information, Susan, on the very last slide of this presentation. Tom had another quick question. If there is only a single source of funding, would not IT and HR be a direct rate?
Yeah, you're right, Tom. Yeah, single source, yeah, you're doing it all. You're it. So remember I said, whatever you charge to indirect could also be a direct cost. Yeah, so if you have one funding stream, I direct charge everything.
Okay, we have a few more questions. Does your indirect cost agreement have to specify equipment in order for it to be considered pass-through?
Pretty much no, I don't think so. But again, I'm not an attorney, so I can't speak to this, but everything I have read on indirect, and if we look at the cost principles and now the new super circular, they all say equipment pulls out. So I think it's written in regulation that equipment pulls out. But again, you would need to talk to someone with a lot more that's an attorney or someone that can legally interpret regs. But I really do believe, because everything, when we look at the regulations, they all say that equipment comes out of the base.
Okay, great. We have a question from Tyler Wright. We have a small nonprofit, a Native immersion school. Annual budget is $550,000. Our only government funding is a grant from A&A that makes up about half of our current budget. We provide daycare, elementary school, and language classes for youth and adults. Do you think establishing an indirect rate makes sense for an organization of our size with a single public grant?
Okay, this is Susan White's opinion only. No. To me, no. There's a lot of work in getting indirect, and I don't see you getting a lot of benefit. I would just direct charge it, and if I have certain things, you'd probably need to be supported by a cost allocation plan, and I think that's easy. That would be the easy way to go. And if you need any help with the cost allocation plan, just let me know.
Okay, we have another question. As a nonprofit entity, who would be our cognizant agency if our current funding source is primarily donations?
Do you get any federal funds at all? And if so, whoever gives you the most federal funds. Now, and another case, another nonprofit that I worked with, this is interesting, and they were a very large nonprofit, but they got all of their money from like the county in that. It was pass-through money. And where the money originated from was the Department of Energy. And so we actually had to go in and petition the Department of Energy, and they did negotiate the rate because none of the counties had the capacity. And since the original money started at Department of Energy, they did negotiate the rate. So.
Okay, we have a few more questions. We want to try to end up as close to being on time as possible. I have a very short question. I understand IDC. I understand CSC, but can you explain DCSC?
DCSC. What does that stand for? And DC, I know I've read that, but I need to know the term. DCSC. You caught me off guard.
This is from Vicki Messias.
You know what? And we'll get your information. But what I think it is direct contract support costs. And I think what that is what I was referring to. If you have indirect costs that are directly funded, you're with a tribe, right? I think that's what it's referring to, but it's direct funded indirect, okay? And if that's the case, we can certainly talk about that, because I can talk about that. But let me look that up, and you and I'll get together and talk about that.
Okay, here's another quick question. Is the cognizant agency for a tribal college the Department of Interior or the agency where they receive the most funding?
I think it's the agency where they receive the most funding.
Okay.
So if you get it from DOE, from Department of Education, that might be it. But again, I'll double check. I'm pretty sure on that one, but I'm really sure. I'm pretty sure on that. But, you know, again, it never hurts to check.
How can you obtain a copy of what is included in your tribe's IDC proposal?
Ask the tribe. Ask them what's in our pool. That's what you want to see, I'm assuming. So yeah, just ask them. They submit the proposal. Ask them for a copy of all the costs that are in the indirect pool, cost pool.
As an ANA reviewer, I've seen applicants commit their indirect towards their non-federal share. What do you think of this practice?
It's you mean they're okay? That's that could have two different meanings. One, they're not charging indirect, which means that somebody's supplementing their indirect and they're using that as their non-federal share. That's an individual organizational thing. Would I do it? No, but for some organizations it's right. So it's perfectly allowable. Okay, the second scenario I see that might be happening here is they have their non-federal share. Again, they have to attach indirect to that. You know, you have to attach indirect to everything, even if it's in kind. Okay, so it could be, they could be putting the indirect into the in kind that they're proposing for the non-federal share for A&A.
Okay.
Or it could be the indirect, they're just paying for it with unrestricted funds. I'd charge A&A and use the unrestricted funds to supplement costs of my program, but that's just me. Every organization makes those own individual determinations.
And we have one, we're winding down here now. A large percentage of our revenues are pass-through funds, where we serve as fiscal sponsor for another organization. This greatly reduces our indirect cost rate. Is there a way to adjust for this?
No. I'd like to give you no. Probably, because I worked for an organization where 72% of the money was passed through to the tribes. And basically, you know, there's nothing you can do about it. I mean, that's just how it is. And your rate's going to be what your rate is. You know, again, you're going to have to look at your mix of your, you know, are there any limitations on the mix of your funding streams? Usually that works to your advantage if you have a lot of pass-through, though, because usually they say it's 10% of total grant award. So really, once you take the pass-through out, you've got a lot more than 10%. But no, I don't know any workarounds on that.
We just got a comment from Laura Melton, and she said that DCSC is direct contract support cost. BIA distributes and can only be used on certain items.
Okay,
and
good. Thank you.
Thank
so
you.
It's a definition within the contract support costs.
Right.
Okay.
Thank you, Laura. And very last question, and then we're going to wind it up. When you submit your IDC rate for approval, how do you obtain the status of your proposal?
Call them. It does take a while. Usually, you know, once you have a cognizant agency and you submit it, you start establishing a relationship with that cognizant agency. And you know, I talk to them all the time. You know, call them, ask them, talk to them. You know, where's it at? I know currently our cognizant agency, they just have such a huge backlog that it takes about 6 months. You know, they'll say you're in the hopper, you know, things like that. But I actually, and this is something I probably should talk about, I think it's really important to establish a relationship with your cognizant agency, you know, and just like you do with all of your funding streams. But, you know, I might be too bold, but I just call them.
All right, and that's it for our questions today. I don't see any more hands up or any more questions, so we want to thank you again for joining us today. Again, you will be able to access this recording in about 2 weeks if you want to review the information. And if you'd like to forward a question to Susan directly, her email address is up on the screen. So thank you, and please join us for our next webinar on July 10th. Have a great morning or remainder of your afternoon, whichever applies. Thank you.